Greg, I just can't get enough of you. I don't know why. I think, Greg, it would be just as a last piece of conversation before
Sure.
we say see you later to each other. I never say goodbye. I have a question for you, which is I've heard you talking about the idea that organizations should get better at demonstrating how they
Yep.
manage their risks. And one way of doing it is that through this idea of critical risk controls.
Yep.
Would you like to give me a little bit more on this before, and then let's have a conversation on this, because I think that's a really
Okay.
good topic to cover.
Where that has come from for me is basically analysis of major accident events over the years. And we see repeatedly coming out of major accident events, so you go back to BP Texas City, where the focus on personal injury rates was criticised and the organisation wasn't focused on critical risks in the business. And you jump forward to something like the Pike River Royal Commission, which was an underground coal mine fatality in New Zealand, where the Royal Commission said that they criticised the board for focusing on injury rate data and said the board appears to have received no information proving the effectiveness of crucial systems. And so we have this very strong current through major accident inquiries and through prosecutions of organisations focusing on a whole range of issues in safety, but not the things that can lead to fundamental disasters and critical failures. And I just think that as a matter of governance and assurance, organisations need to understand what their critical risks are, or their crucial systems, or there's a decision, a New South Wales District Court decision that talks about fundamental processes. You know, what are the actually important things in our organisation that are going to prevent catastrophic event, and how do we focus on those and get assurance that they're working well. And that can be problematic. That can be problematic. So we know, and again in an Australian context, we know, for example, that workers' compensation claims can be a big driver of cost in businesses in Australia. But most of the things that lead to workers' compensation issues are not necessarily critical risks that are going to result in catastrophic events. So it's very easy to lose sight of the critical to focus on maybe trivial but important but not critical, if that makes sense. So there's a bit of that. And I also think we have a problem. I suspect it's a global problem from what I'm seeing around the place, but certainly an Australian problem. We have this overwhelming, perhaps in some organisations, overwhelming emphasis on psychosocial safety. Now, again, it's important, but there's an issue of criticality, and lots of safety departments are investing lots and lots of energy at the moment in trying to come to terms with this new brief they've been given by the regulator. And it's not new, that's a misnomer, but everyone's perceiving it as new. And I'm just concerned that we are going to see an uptick in serious physical harm because of resources being applied to this other area in ways that many organisations are simply not equipped to deal with.
There's quite a few things I would like to unpack with
Sure.
you, but let's just pick 2 or 3 of them. One is I could probably share my experience on the critical risk controls, and I think there is something to be said about the whole idea of a critical risk, because there's a book here in front of us where we talk about the Costa Concordia accident. And the trouble with the idea of critical risk, and you know, if you talk about shipping industry, for example, there are not too many critical risks. We have seen time and again collisions, elisions, groundings, fire, explosion, and so on. So in some ways, the consequence, if that's what you mean, is very clearly understood that this is what risk means. That's one problem. So And a related problem as a result of that is that very quickly those kind of risks become normalized in the organization. At
Yep.
least what the organization is doing about it
Yeah.
and how far it pushes the boundaries of its operations becomes very, very normalized. So it's very hard for people working within the context to see what is critical and what is not critical until it actually shows up. And I think maybe there is something there to be unpacked.
I think, and I hadn't thought about it until you just raised it then, but I think in part that normalisation is influenced by the way that we measure safety. So if we're measuring safety by counting the amount of activity doesn't tend to change, even though the risk might be changing before us, but we're doing the same amount of activity, so the information that the organisation gets is business as usual. So because the way we measure and count safety doesn't reveal much about the risk, it simply normalises activity. So there might be something to that. I hadn't thought that through until you just mentioned it. But again, because we don't have good narrative explanations of what we're seeing, it becomes very easy to disguise drift or normalisation behind activity.
And that's a really important point to from my point of view, because there are instances when you can go and interview people, because essentially how do you get that information through on board a ship? You can get it through navigation equipment, by talking to people, collecting information, triangulating it between stuff. But essentially one of the big problems is that people who are on the ground, who are supposed to give you that information, don't see it as a risk at all. So you need a level of imagination, you need a level of critical thinking, discerning, listening to get to that point.
Yep.
And I think that is something we see is by and large missing in the way we do audits and investigations.
Because I think again, if I go back to some of my preliminary ideas, I think it's because the process becomes the purpose. So we're doing audits, or we're having conversations, or we're doing inspections, not to understand but to complete a process. And that's to a greater or lesser degree. Or I'm not saying that every time somebody undertakes a safety activity it's completely mechanistic.
Of course not.
But parts of it very often are. And it strikes me that there is in most organisations, there's no real overt agenda to understand or to get uncomfortable. We're much better at driving comfort.
Yeah, and I think there's another element to it, which is if you're walking the same street each day, every day, you don't see a problem at all.
No.
So it's very, very hard for people to see something objectively and say that yesterday it wasn't a risk, but today it has become a risk.
Yeah.
And I think that's a difficult thing to grasp with. That's one thing.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things that I've been talking about lately is the number of assumptions that underpin what we do in safety, or the information we receive. And again, the assumptions are never overt. So if we're saying we've closed out all the corrective actions, there's a tremendous number of assumptions that have to underpin that as a measure of anything. You know, starting from what does close out mean? Does that mean something's actually been done, or is it just being ticked off as closed out? All the way back to the competence of the people to form the view that these were good corrective actions in the first place.
Yes.
And I don't see much challenge to our underpinning assumptions.
No, and it just reminds me of an exercise we did yesterday, a workshop we did yesterday, as we were mapping the conversation on the whiteboard. Something as subtle as this person had the practical experience, and despite the practical experience, this thing happened. And this person who was listening actually chased the idea, what is practical experience? And underneath that, there was a huge assumption. And the point I'm trying to make is this, that we are not good at listening, we are not good at discerning, we are not good at opening up those conversations. That's that was one thing.
Yeah.
Do you want to say something?
I was just going to say most organisations structurally aren't designed to do it. And this was a conversation we had yesterday. Most organisations have like a 21 or 28 day time limit to do an investigation.
Yes.
So you just don't have the bandwidth or the space to open up those conversations anyway.
And the thing that I find interesting is that you could have, and this happens a lot in safety audits, that you could go and issue 20 non-conformities as part of your safety audit, but you could actually just issue one and really open it up well and do a good job there.
Yep.
And it could be a combination of both.
Yep.
It could be a combination of a qualitative and a quantitative kind of
Yeah, I think there is a compelling argument, and I've touched on this with like Professor Drew Ray before as well. There is a compelling argument in safety that I think one of the best things we can do to start shifting a whole lot of dynamics is to do a lot less, but do it better.
thoroughly, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And that's my point, that you go and issue one non-conformance if you have to, but open it up, have a good conversation around it, and if you have a systemic issue, like you said yesterday, it is bound to come up in that
Yeah.
one.
Yes, I think that's right. I believe that, yeah. So
The other thing, Greg, with critical risk controls, I find it very interesting, is that when critical risks become the focus, let's say in my world, an explosion or a fire
Sure.
or a capsizing of a ship and so on, then the whole thing that drives us is consequence. And so this is
Yep.
it's not no longer a risk, it's a consequence, what we are discussing now. Now, the trouble with that is that, first of all, we know risk is not a consequence. Risk is risk, consequence is consequence. Is the outcome of
Yeah.
a particular activity which has gone terribly wrong. Now, risk, in my view, to understand risk takes a huge amount of imagination. It takes imagination to understand what might go wrong in this particular instance, which by its very nature requires us to take a slightly different approach. Because if we were so consequence driven, what happens is it stifles imagination and we become so myopic in our view of what risk should. Do you have any thoughts around that, or have you actually thought about it that way?
no, I haven't thought about it in that way because from my practice and my worldview, consequence is everything, and that's what I mean. There is a vastly different legal consequence to a person losing the top of their finger to a double fatality. So, even though you might be talking about the same risk of a dropped object, for example. So consequence in that context matters. But the question of criticality is one that I think organisations grapple with. So I for many years, I would tell, when I'm doing work with leaders, I would say your real problems start when people die, from a regulatory perspective. But then you start doing work with nursing homes and healthcare providers, and criticality looks really different there, because it's very easy to be critical of organisations that focus on people who get sore backs. Except if you're a healthcare provider with an ageing nursing workforce and you're getting lots of workers' compensation claims and lots of people who can't work, suddenly that is business critical because you can't provide service. So I've learnt slowly, but learnt that criticality is not as objective as we might like to think it is, I think.
Absolutely, and this is a classic problem in my world, at least, that the whole idea of a consequence-driven criticality can put a whole organization into a very myopic kind
Yep.
of a view of what
Yep.
risk is all about.
Yep. I think that's right, and that I think that rings true often around incidents as well, because the tendency to classify the level of investigation you do by the potential consequence is, I think, problematic, because even if you can have a terrible outcome but there's not much opportunity for understanding or learning from that. Sometimes it really is quite simple and linear and mechanistic.
Yeah, suicides is one of them. I mean, it's a terrible thing to talk about, but what could you do? Potentially, what could you do? Well, you can support the family after
Yeah.
an event. What could you do to prevent it? Because anyone who has studied suicides would know that when somebody has made up their mind to commit a suicide, there is nothing much you can do. And so what happens in my world at least is that you are expected to produce a 200 words or 200 page report or 100 page report.
Really?
Yeah, and it's kind of expected in that report that you must have some kind of preventative actions and corrective actions, which is I struggle to understand how you could make something up for something which you have so little control over.
Well, I think that I'm fascinated by that because I haven't had a lot of experience in that area, but I suspect that's going to become a prevalent theme in Australia. We see it a lot already in the construction industry. There's lots of noise about the number of young men who suicide in the construction industry. There was a report several years ago in the WA mining industry as well. And there would be plenty of people out there far more expert than me who could talk about the ability of a workplace to impact on individuals' suicidal tendencies.
And then one final point, Greg, on critical risks is this, that often the idea of critical risk control is linked with the notion that risks should be prevented. So consequence should be prevented. Nothing should go wrong. And I think that's a good goal. But often what we see happens is that when shit happens, when things go out of control, your emergency processes, your business continuity plans, your recovery plans, disaster recovery plans, you come to understand that people are not really, haven't even imagined that something of this sort could happen.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
I haven't had a lot of involvement in, I mean, when I say I haven't had a lot, I find that when I have to attend fatalities and the critical incident response team has been convened, there's two parts of it. One is the reasonably comfortable mechanistic completion of the log, following what do we do, but the other part of it is the people who are face to face with the crisis, and it never goes according to plan. I don't think anyone reasonably expects that it would. I mean, when something goes badly wrong, most plans go out the window pretty quick, and you spend the first 48 hours almost in that flight and fight response to deal with the situations in front of you.
It does, and the point I'm trying to make is that sometimes we have to be very, very careful about what is that we push for. If the end goal is to just avoid even talking about the consequence of things going wrong, the imagination of what happens and how prepared people are to actually cope with that reality, it goes terribly, terribly badly. I've seen people freeze, they're in trauma, they have no idea how to work through that emergency or that uncertainty. And it's just something we see a lot. And I think a lot of it has to do with how an organization understands what is a critical risk and how to actually address those risks.
So emergency response in and of itself would be what the Pike River Royal Commission referred to as a crucial system, I think. But again, a lot of it, underpinning a lot of this for me, is the thing that I have just been bumping up against for so many years, is that question of, well, how do you know that it works? What assurance do you have about the level of efficacy or response that you're going to get? And that, to me, that is still, I think, an important missing piece.
And it trickles down to the level of a seafarer or a worker.
Oh,
because,
yeah, absolutely.
It's so interesting that sometimes you are standing and just reviewing a risk assessment from a seafarer, and you ask the question, well, nowhere in this risk assessment it says that if the wire fall parts, what would you do? What is the next course of action? And the response to that sort of question is, well, that's precisely why we are doing the risk assessment, because so that it doesn't happen.
It doesn't happen. Yeah. Yes, I think there's a lot of that false confidence in our risk processes.
Isn't it?
Yeah,
Yes.
very much.
Great.
Okay.
Greg, what a wonderful chat. Is there anything else you want to discuss?
No, it was really good to catch up with you again, Nippon. It's great to have you over here running your course. And hopefully, if we get all our ducks in a row, I can be over in England in April and we can do some stuff together over there.
Shall we make an announcement on this? I think we've already done that.
I did, deliberately. We are planning, very deliberately planning for Nippon and I to get together in the UK initially in April next year to see if we can run some programs together. So
all right. We'll be back with some more news very soon.
Very good. Thanks,
Thank you,
Nippon.
Greg. Thanks
Cheers.
a lot.
Take care.
Yes, yes.